I'm Cynthia Hutchison with Automation Alley, and we're here with episode, I think, 12 of the New Normal series. So today, we are going to have Jason Brome with us. He's with CenturyLink, and we're going to talk about how companies can leverage data for a smarter return to work. We've been talking this whole series about return to work, different methods, different strategies for getting to work, and some COVID mitigation strategies that will help you get back to work safely with happy and healthy employees. So Jason, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, nice to have you. So we're finding that data is really the key to fighting coronavirus. In what ways are companies using data to make more informed return to work decisions and choices?
Wow, that's a big question. I will try to get through it. So as we look at re-entering the workspace, right, and fighting the pandemic that we find ourselves in, we're seeing the gamut of data requirements, we're seeing the gamut of data concerns, and we're seeing the gamut of data confusion within our customers in different segments. What we find is working best when we start to talk with customers is that, there are so many data points and data capabilities out there, but until a company really sits down and defines what they're planning to accomplish with data and reentry, it's an interesting theoretical conversation, but it's not an actionable conversation. And so when these companies start to think about reentering and what do they want to accomplish with a reentry, they need to get together as a leadership team and sit down and have these brutal, honest discussions about what is important and what they want to accomplish. The interesting thing is that most of these conversations are not led by technology, even though we're the owners of the data. It's more led by the human resources department, right? As one shining example, how to handle the people. They're handled by the legal department. What can we do? What should we do? What can't we do? What shouldn't we do, right? Operations, because they're going to tell you what the different areas of responsibility are. So is there warehouse, is there distribution centers, is there corporate facilities, are there field operations, right? There's so many different aspects in each of these companies. And then finally, of course, information technology needs to have a seat at the table, right? Because we are the purveyors of the data, right? Or at least the gatherers of the data, right? We may not actually own the data at the end of the day, but we are the ones that gather it up and know where all of it lies. I forgot to mention one team, safety. If a company has a safety department, they become key. And so, not only do they have to have all of these disparate teams within the organization come together and discuss this, there also are industry-specific concerns that have to come into account, right? For example, manufacturing, right? Are social distancing one of your major concerns and you want to have compliance with that you can report on? Okay, so in a manufacturing location, that means it's something completely different than, say, a fulfillment warehouse. Or that means something completely different to a retail company that has customers coming into hundreds, if not thousands of locations around the country or even around the globe. And they have to track that information as well. Or what information can they track? What information should they track? And so this becomes a really involved conversation merely just to define what the needs are, right? And so if we could get down to the different locations even that need to be there, right? So a warehouse is different than a corporate headquarters. And a corporate headquarters is different than, in our industry at CenturyLink, right, our network operations centers. We have network operations centers located around the globe. We have to staff those 24/7, 365. What does that mean to our COVID reentry program, right? Because these are essential employees that haven't left since the pandemic began, but can we implement new strategies into keeping them as safe as possible? So as you start to look at all of those different things, if we can bring everybody together and have all of these different conversations, then we can start to come up with a strategy, right? To say, this is what we want to look at. This is what we want to protect against. This is what we want the users to be able to experience. This is what we want to be able to communicate to the employees on an ongoing basis to what we're doing. Because some of these technologies can feel a little intrusive, right, to an employee base, especially a global employee base. So once you kind of get everybody to come together, right, you have to just define those statements, right? So is the goal of a reentry program simple compliance with, oh, by the way, the myriad of different rules that are out there from a federal, from a state, from a county or a province, or, and then a local municipality. So, oh, by the way, they don't always agree with each other. And so how do you comply with all of that? Then finally, is it simple compliance? Is there a real-time remediation part of this that you want to implement, right? So, in the event that, say, you want to have a real-time remediation, if it's determined that there are too many people in an area of the business, who do you contact? What are they authorized to do? We've seen in the news some of these retail stories about, employees of a company enforcing policy or enforcing public health orders, and bad things are happening. And so what does a company want to do about that? Do they want to, are they able or ready to potentially have those kind of conversations? And so where is the line of where they're willing to go?
So theoretically, I'm going to stop. So theoretically, what we're doing is, while we're protecting a segment of the population or a group of employees, we're also putting, and I'm going to just, in retail, for example, you're putting somebody who hired on to be a sales clerk or sales associate in a policing role, which marginalizes his or her safety in a different way, because all of a sudden we've got people screaming and yelling at people and things that they didn't sign up for as their original core job. So that goes back to, that flips you back into HR and legal again, beyond technology, into the human decisions of how to manage it. Interesting.
So what we're really seeing right now is that when we talk with the information technology departments and our customers, they are being asked what can be done. In the IT department, if we have a chance to speak with them, we'd like them to push back saying what should be done. And then that becomes a really interesting conversation, right? And most of the time when we're having these conversations, we're having them at the leadership level. It's interesting how the conversation starts. It's usually a couple of members of the true kind of company leadership are in a Zoom room, and they go, well, what do you think about? And then the question kind of expands from there of, well, what can we do? What technology can do? What does people do, right? And then and then eventually it'll go over to what we can do from a technology perspective, and then it starts driving down the information technology department. And then eventually it gets to the guy that is in charge of data. The data architect gets involved, or the network manager, or the systems manager, and they're going, huh? And they literally just that deer in the headlight look of, what do you mean? I have all this technology out here that I manage, right? But what do you mean I need to ensure compliance?
Interesting.
And so that's where taking these data, these feeds of data that we can get from all kinds of different technologies, driving that into a solution becomes, that can be usable by all those different departments, safety and HR and legal and IT and all those things, to where they can decide what the business can do or what the business should do. That's really where we think the interesting conversation lies.
And are you seeing a growing interest in having IT at the table? Is that beginning to happen more organically, or is that still a bit of a struggle with most companies?
Yes. Some companies we are seeing that have a seat at the table already and are involved very early in the conversations, right? Usually companies of more size and scale that have a chief information officer, a chief technical officer, right, that are in those leadership meetings, that can hear the head of HR and the CEO or the COO or whoever begins the conversation can hear the conversation happen at its inception and start to ask the right questions from a technology perspective. That's one scenario. The other scenario is that the inception conversations happen at a leadership level and technology is never thought of until, right? And then eventually those are the ones that get driven down to the network manager or the systems manager or the data architect, and all of a sudden they go, what? Because they didn't understand the reasoning behind the question. And so one of the things we've done as CenturyLink is that we've been out there evangelizing this conversation we're having right now with our large IT customers so that they are at least prepared when that conversation comes down, to where they're not going to just give that deer in the headlight look. Say, oh yeah, I talked with a company and there's some stuff we can look at.
Right.
And then it moves from there.
All right. Well, I know you have a slide and I want to look at it because you showed it to me briefly. So Jason and I just met this morning and he's out in Denver, by the way, one of my favorite cities. I miss it terribly. I haven't been out there for a long time. So we're now going to talk a little bit about contact tracing and how companies can incorporate it into their return to work plan. And I know you have a slide for it. So if you show it to us and I could actually learn more about it this time.
All righty. One moment, please, while we click on all the right buttons.
By the way, Jason has his home is as studio-esque as any home office I've seen. It's pretty cool.
Remind me next time, I will put a picture of what I look at while I'm talking to all of you in this. It's an interesting conversation to see how the new workforce works.
Yes.
Okay, so here is the slide. So it's a journey, right? To be able to use technology to gather information, to be able to report or influence, compliance or safety. So we start in the bottom left, right? So on the bottom left-hand side of this screen, you see a potentially infected person, right? Going into an office location, going into a retail location, really going into a location. There are different technologies that may or may not be sitting in that location that can be used as data points. So again, it's all about collecting data. It's less about what the technology is. It's more about what we can get out of it. So on the left-hand side here, my first and foremost one that most every enterprise has in their corporate locations, it's badge reader access control, right? It's not the most specific, data point we could ever get, but it's a very simple data point we can get, right? Typically, famous last words, right? Those badge reader access inputs will be written to a database. And then from there, you can design a query to pull that information out, deliver it across that dashed green line into a data warehouse, right? Just happens to have a CenturyLink logo on it, but it can be delivered to a data warehouse. And that can be one data point, right? That works well for, say, a location where you want to track the number of simultaneous people in a building. You say, I've got 500,000 square feet, so I know based on social distancing, best practices, that means I'm going to have no more than 550 people in that building at any one time. And if your employees are badging in and badging out, that gives you a count, right? It's almost like when you go to a retail store and you see that person standing up there with that clicker. Yes. That's kind of the technology equivalent to the dude with a clicker or the gal with a clicker, right? But it's a good data point. There may be certain locations that may be enough. There may be certain locations where we want to dig deeper. So the next one over there is a Wi-Fi signal, right? One of the greatest inventions to track people is this thing we all have in our pockets, right? I am as bad as everybody, and I'm an information security technologist, and I still have this thing on with the Wi-Fi always turned on because I'm too lazy to get to my house and remember to turn my Wi-Fi on, or I get to my office and turn the Wi-Fi on. So it's on constantly. So you're constantly having those pings sent out. And even though I may not connect to the Wi-Fi technologies that are in place today can go, oh, that's somebody new. I will track them. right? And I will see them come in through the front door. I will see them move throughout the building to get to the next Wi-Fi access point. I will see them go to the third floor. I will see them go to the fourth floor. I will see them slowly move around a building, and there will be some level of a unique identifier. Now, I won't be able to tie that to a person unless there are, ways to do that, but there are some ways to do that. But in a typical environment, I will just know that there is a person and I can watch them walk through a building. Now, Wi-Fi, as we all know, can go through walls. It sometimes, depending on the structure of the building, can go through ceilings and floors. And so it may not be as precise as needed to do, say, a social distancing conversation. Right. We may find that somebody connected to the break room Wi-Fi that's actually in their office below or above the break room, and it may give us some false positives. Right. So again, what we're trying to do is gather as much data as possible through these different technologies so that then we can do some intelligence on the data. Third one in is a camera. This is usually the most concerning statement I make during these conversations, right? Cameras concern people. Do we record? Do we hold on to? Do we? I'm from a CenturyLink perspective, right? I'm looking to the customer to say, what would you like me to do with this data? There are cameras out there today that can do a myriad of different things, that they can identify bodies. They have infrared technologies built into them so I can tell the temperature of different things in a room. So those can be used for in a myriad of different ways. Those could potentially be used to determine if someone has a temperature. Sometimes they're not that precise, or maybe they can go, hey, something's not right over there. But they also can tell us how many heat blooms are in a room, so I can count the number of bodies in that room, or I can see if there's a large concentration of heat blooms that may be a group of people sitting at a table that may be too many for social distancing rules, right? So we can use that information as well. Again, these are just data points, right? We take this video feed ingest, we take it into the edge of our network, we do the analytics on that video in real time to be able to see what we need to determine out of that, and then we feed that data into the data warehouse. Another one that customers are starting to implement in enterprise space is RFID tags, right? Simple. And if in a retail space, you've got the RFID readers that are being security devices in all your retail locations. So those can be used to, again, gather where people walk by something and it gets pinged. Right. And those sensors can be much less expensive than, say, a significant amount of cameras deployed. Or. So all of these different technologies are being used to gather data. We're not really using the data. We're not using each one of these technologies to do something specific. We're just gathering data. And some devices and some solutions are more specific than others. The last one in this little example, though, is Bluetooth. Bluetooth beacons are relatively inexpensive, can be deployed relatively quickly throughout a business. And again, wonderful part about these devices is I've also got my Bluetooth turned on all the time because I'm too lazy to remember when I get in my car to turn it on, right? Or my Bluetooth headset or. So people are giving us this information willingly, if not lazily. So we take all of these different data points and we bring them into the data warehouse or a data lake. Or I'm not a data analyst, so I'm sure I'm using all the wrong terms, and I'm sure the viewers will correct me if I use these terms incorrectly. But hey, it's all good. We bring all these data feeds in, right, across all these different locations. We've also got an example retail or office location there where we're able to bring all this information in. We then drive all that data into a portal. And that portal is where the analytics is happening, right? And all the analysis is happening, saying, well, based on the badge reader, based on the Wi-Fi, based on the camera, let's just say those three were already implemented, we believe that there are 7 people in the break room and there should only be 6. And then so if we determine that happens, what would you like us to do with that? Is that an immediate response, a text message, an email, a alert to an application living on a mobile phone, to the safety and security department or the department manager or the facilities manager, right? Because we just have a framework of ingesting data from different points, and then we have that information, being manipulated and analyzed and being delivered over here. We then can set what parameters and what actions need to happen. That's really at essence what we're attempting to do with this, right? In a real-time perspective. Now, I haven't brought up the word contact tracing yet because there's a different usage when we start talking about contact tracing, right? Because again, now all of a sudden it's more of a historical conversation than a real-time conversation. I want to know 2 weeks later where Mary was. I don't know why I'll pick on the name Mary today, but we'll pick on the name Mary today. Right. We, 2 weeks after the fact, we need to know where Mary was in the office. And depending on what technologies are in play and what kind of a location Mary went in, will be the different levels of reporting that are available. Right. If all we had for Mary's office was the badge reader, we can tell when Mary went in and we can tell when Mary went out. And that may be enough. Right. The other conversation we have around contact tracing is that how do I identify Mary? Is me as the solution provider is just getting all of these, unique identifier digit strings, right? An IMEI number or a MAC address or things of that nature is how I know who Mary is. But how does the customer know who Mary is, right? Can they know that that digit string of that MAC address is who Mary is? Do they ask Mary if she tells the business that she has tested positive? Do they ask her for the MAC address of her mobile phone? Can they ask her for the MAC address of her mobile phone?
Great questions. I can't wait for you to answer them.
Unfortunately, the technology can't answer that question. The technology can report the information, but that's why as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, you have to have the business involved. Right. The legal, the HR, those types of teams so that they can decide at the beginning what information needs to be collected and what information is actionable and what are the policies that are going to be written around this reentry. We as technologists can deliver a tremendous amount of information, but I can't always tell you what to do with it.
And this is where it's, the opportunities to collect data and use the data and analyze the data are huge, but it is a policy-driven decision. If you start to align a test result with an individual and you know who that individual is, you have an entire different level of agreements that he or she made with your organization in order to move forward. And otherwise, I think those are the exposures that are very interesting.
Yes. And those have been the biggest points of contention in the customers I've spoken with about this, is that they don't always take into account when they're having these initial conversations, in the best interest of their company and their employees, how do we keep everybody safe? How do we make sure if something happens, how do we respond? But they didn't go into that level of detail of what are we tracking and what are we reporting on and how long do we retain this information? Do we have a flush of information every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, every 5 weeks, every 10? What is that data retention policy? There's just so many conversations that may have to happen outside of the technologist. Another interesting conversation from a data collection perspective can be a mobile application that gets put on a phone that can tie all of this together, can take the employee information and the device information and marry all that together into databases. But if it is a corporate-owned asset, do you just push the mobile app down? What do you tell the employee if it's a bring your own device company, which my company is as an example? Do I have to then install that application on my personally owned device to gain access into my corporate locations? What about retail customers? They're just, and so unfortunately, there is no silver bullet here. And what we've tried to do at CenturyLink is because we realize there is no silver bullet here. As you notice, we're not coming out here with a very specific product saying, this is how we do it. Because as soon as I say, this is how we do it, the first customer I'm going to talk to says, no, that's not how we're doing it. And so we've built that framework. to be able to ingest all of these different potential data access feeds, or help our customers deploy new data access feeds. To where, if they come up to us and say, we'd love to be able to do social distancing, but we have nothing other than a badge reader. Okay. The final piece of this conversation that gets interesting is that if new technology is determined to be deployed for COVID compliance, what happens when the pandemic is over? I've bought all this gear. I've built all this stuff. What do I do with it? There's a conversation around the monetization of these assets and what can be used. Those are sometimes a challenging conversation, right? If on a corporate facility, what are we gaining from this? Can we look at workforce efficiency? Can we look at automation? Can we look at different technologies like that? In a retail location, it's probably the easiest conversation right now that we've had, is that unfortunately it can be used to get some marketing data and some marketing insights. Watching how people walk through your retail locations can help you automate and optimize your retail locations for maximum throughput or maximum, visibility of whatever is the special of the week, for example.
That's fascinating. Well, one of the things that, first of all, so this screen that we're looking at right now, this is a snapshot in time. This is real-time data gathering. Not to be confused with contact tracing, because the contact tracing is what the customer wants to do with the data and what they ask CenturyLink or their IT partner to drive down, or their internal IT, what they ask for collection. This is simply having access to as much data as possible from which you can derive solid decision-making with leadership. Does that sum it up?
That would be a correct statement, yes. Yeah, we use real-time compliance data to drive contact tracing if required.
And it's funny when you talk about how to monetize this in the end, in that hopefully soon to happen post-COVID era that we're all looking forward to. I've thought a lot about that in many ways, and I alluded to this earlier before we got on air. Automation Alley deals with a lot of small to mid-sized manufacturing companies who weren't ready to move into even a full sensor environment, even a full access. They were small, mid-sized, they didn't really have to, and didn't now, in order to reopen, they've had to take these COVID mitigation strategies, which in many cases will leave behind a piece of technology with a pivotable reapplication that can take them into a phase that would advance their manufacturing, much like your allusion in the retail example.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's going to be an exciting change we could see. But I can see there's a vulnerability in leaving all that behind as well.
Oh, yeah. More data means more information.
Yes. And one other thing I was going to ask you about is a little bit about thermal imaging. I know that we had notes on that. Can you talk a little bit about how, before we wrap up, if that's important, how we can utilize that or not?
Yeah. So, the thermal imaging technology has been around for many years. Different manufacturers had different levels of it. Some of the manufacturers have come out with a simple, they've got a camera and a tablet. And as you walk by, it gives you a stoplight, right, as one example of just a very simple, very fast, non-intrusive, just as you're walking by it, it scans your body and says, ooh, you're, not 37 degrees Celsius, you're 41. We need you to not go in, right? And so, the green light, red light. That's one example of it. A lot of these newer cameras that can be installed from a security perspective, there may already be installed, have infrared technologies built into them. And so those can be used in a thermal imaging way to also determine potentially, though it also depends on what the range, and different manufacturers have different specifications for what these cameras can or cannot do. But they can look at in a manufacturing area to say, okay, I can count the number of people that are in an area relatively quickly because that room is 71 degrees, but all of the people are 98 degrees. So it allows us, that thermal imaging allows us to see how many people are in an area at a very rapid rate, right? Without having to do a lot of analytics. We just count heat blooms. And so that's another use for it. But I think most of your users are probably thinking it more from an access control perspective. And so do you do active access control or do you do passive access control when it comes to thermal imaging? That again, there are technology solutions for both. It really kind of drives back again into the business to say, what would you like us to do, business owner, when it comes to access control? So, like I said, the technology can be the simple green light, red light, and that's an example of active access control. Or that same technology can just be watching and then alerting somebody if they get a heat bloom above normal, and then a person can come out of the security department or from behind the front desk or what have you, and have that conversation with the end user to say, are you feeling okay? And go from there. So thermal imaging is a relatively simple technology to deploy, but again becomes a much more complex conversation about how to deploy and why you want to deploy it.
Wonderful. I wish we had more time. This has been a really, really interesting discussion for us. I hope we'll have you back in some other environment, maybe in a non-COVID conversation, where we can talk about a lot of the other security things that are instrumental in keeping our businesses safe, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And here in the state of Michigan, we worry a lot about manufacturing security as it applies to our automotive factories and cybersecurity for autonomous vehicles. So we've got a lot of conversations in our future. Thank you for joining us today, Jason. Jason Brome.
Thank you.
Link. If anybody has any questions, you can ask through us and we'll direct you to Jason, unless you want to give us a way to reach you directly.
I will let them come through the thing. My travel schedule was really busy before, and now I'm so busy on email and stuff. I would hate for someone to have a delay in getting a response directly from me.
They'll funnel in for us, and we'll funnel it through the team appropriately.
Perfect.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you all for joining us.